So we've covered the meditation method, Shamatha Vipassana meditation. We've covered the 4 foundations of mindfulness, which, as you learned, are instructions first on what to do during meditation, the actual technique, and then how to apply that ever-deepening level of concentration to other important themes of the Buddha's Dhamma, such as the hindrances, the clinging aggregates, the 7 factors of awakening, and now the 4 noble truths. And remember, that's how the 4 foundations, the Tathagata Sutta concludes with that, of holding in mind the four noble truths. And so the Buddha awakened to the profound understanding. Let me backtrack a little bit. At the age of 29, the Buddha first left his the palace, his home, and for the first time encountered real suffering in the world. He was shielded from this. And it so surprised him and shocked him of why would people have a life that is so prone to disappointment and suffering? And he saw the somewhat legendary aspects as he was walking down a road, and he saw a sleeping man who he mistook for sleeping, and he was dead. He saw an old man bent over, and he couldn't understand any of this. And then he walked into the marketplace, into the town, and he saw the competitiveness and aggressiveness of people fighting with each other over what he thought and saw as insignificant scraps. And so he left, and he wanted to understand a very specific thing. What is this thing called suffering? What am I looking at? And why are we so prone to it? Why does everybody engage in something that brings so much suffering into their lives? And so after 6 years of traveling around northern India, studying with some of the foremost so-called spiritual teachers of his time, most of the studies were based, as were most spiritual teachings at the time, based on the Vedas and the Upanishads, the precursor to modern Hinduism. And he rejected all of those teachings and different meditation techniques as not leading to his goal of simply understanding stress. He wasn't looking for a magical, mystical way of looking at the world or living in the world or an escape from the world. He wasn't looking to start another religion. He wasn't looking to even gain followers. He wanted to develop understanding for himself. And after those 6 years of arduous study and travel around northern India, an interesting fact to me is that the Buddha never left a 400 square mile. What am I trying to say? A small area in northern India. And yet his influence is all over the world, and it's continued 2,600 years. Amazing what the truth will bring. So he, after all that struggle and study, self-reflection, outer reflection, looking at the world, he came to the profound understanding that it is ignorance, a very specific ignorance of these 4 noble truths that lead to all manner of confusion, deluded thinking, and ongoing suffering. This is his great awakening. Now, he didn't teach dependent origination at first, because that's more it's a very practical teaching, but it's also the conceptual theory underlying and underpinning what his very first teaching was. And this is his very first teaching. And it took place, excuse me, a little bit more background. Most of the time the Buddha, Siddhartha, was wandering around northern India. He did so with these 5 fellows that he met along the way, all seeking understanding and all basically having the same experiences. About a month prior to this encounter, the Buddha had left his 5 buddies because he was walking down the road near Isipatana, and he passed out from these severe ascetic practices he was having. It said that he was living on 1 grain of rice or 1 bean a day. And even his accounting later in another sutta was that he could touch his spine by touching the front of his belly. That's how emaciated he was. And these were accepted practices then and still today, that if you deny the body enough, self-denial, somehow you'll free the mind from the body. Think about that, just that alone. Why would someone want to free their mind from the body? The Buddha taught something, Siddhartha taught something completely opposite, didn't he? How to unite and keep the mind in the body moment by moment. So one, in a general way, the general focus of so-called spirituality was escape from suffering, from the world. The Buddha taught not an escape, but how to understand it. And by understanding it, then we can stop fighting it and running away from it and develop a mind of calm and peace. So we awaken to, from ignorance of Four Noble Truths, all manner of suffering arises. So just to continue the setting, the Buddha awakened, and now he sat off and on in meditation for 2 more weeks, considering, how can I teach this profound understanding in a way that's going to pierce the common human problem of ignorance? And if you think about that a little bit, a mind that's rooted in ignorance, a mind that is deluded, has no frame of reference for understanding its own ignorance, does it? No matter what you're, if you think you know how to change the oil in a car, and what you believe is that you take a 5-gallon pail of paint and pour it in the trunk, and you think that's good, you're not going to go any further than just that, are you? And no matter what people tell you, if you believe that, you're going to insist that what you're doing is right. That's the nature of ignorance. To continue, despite all evidence to the contrary, a mind rooted in ignorance will create these very powerful and subtle strategies to ignore its own ignorance. That's the essence of I-making. It's the essence of the Buddha's understanding of the not-self characteristic. And so upon his awakening, he considered if there was even a way to, even if it was possible to actually teach other human beings what he had now understood, knowing what he knew about the nature of ignorance in a mind that is rooted in delusion. And so he realized this Eightfold Path as the path that would guide people whose minds are rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths in a very direct and gentle way towards understanding of Four Noble Truths. Again, the whole purpose of the Buddha's Dhamma is to go from ignorance to understanding. And so from that understanding to develop a calm and peaceful mind. So 2 weeks after his awakening, the Buddha has now decided, okay, I know what to teach. He went through some internal struggles about even if it was worth it. Does he want to go through the trouble? He decided that he would. And now he's walking down the dusty road in northern India, seeing what comes up. And so this sutta starts with this. I have heard that on this occasion, the Buddha was staying at Varanasi in the game refuge at Isipatana. There he addressed a group of 5, his 5 buddies. There are these 2 extremes that are not to be indulged in by one who has gone forth. Gone forth is simply someone who has left the home life or the homeless life, gone forth, meaning seeking understanding. For those who have gone forth. Which 2? That which is devoted to sensual pleasure with reference to sensual objects. This behavior is base, vulgar, common, ignoble, and unprofitable. It is devoted to self-affliction. And then the other extreme is that which is devoted to self-affliction is always painful and ignoble, meaning the life that the Buddha lived as a prince in his father's kingdom was just that. It was completely devoted to ongoing, moment by moment, satisfaction of sensory needs and sensual pleasure. In fact, his father went way overboard in giving young Siddhartha from the time he was born every imaginable luxury with the hope that this would convince Siddhartha to take over the throne one day rather than leave. And so then the Buddha did leave, and he spent that 6 years practicing very, very severe ascetic practices, self-affliction, self-denial. And so from his own direct experience, he realized the middle way. Avoiding both of these extremes, the middle way is realized by the Tathagata. The Tathagata means the one who has gone forth, and it's the only reference the Buddha ever used towards himself. He never called himself the Buddha or an awakened one, although he qualified that awakening in another sutta. The Buddha continues, this middle way produces vision and knowledge. This middle way leads to, he's describing why we would want to develop the Buddha's Dhamma, or engage in the middle way, the Eightfold Path. This middle way leads to calm, to direct knowledge, to self-awakening, and to unbinding. Unbinding from what? Unbinding from ignorant views. And what is the middle way realized by the Tathagata that brings vision and direct knowledge that leads to calm and to self-awakening and unbinding? The middle way is precisely this noble eightfold path. And this is remember, the very first teaching the Buddha gave, everything the Buddha taught for his 45-year teaching career was taught in the context of what he awakened, dependent origination, and in the context of Four Noble Truths. And he never varied from that in any way. And so a good way to evaluate a teaching that might be called a Buddhist teaching is, does it relate in some direct way to Four Noble Truths? If it doesn't, it's simply not something that the Buddha taught. What is that eightfold path? It is right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right meditation. Remember that the eightfold path is the fourth of the Four Noble Truths. And he always described these noble truths as timeless, meaning that they are just as applicable now as they were during the Buddha's time. And we know that. We know it from direct experience. This is the middle way realized by the Tathagata that brings vision, direct knowledge that leads to calm, to self-awakening, and to unbinding. He's emphasizing it is this simple eightfold path and nothing else. If you want to, not as the Buddha, if you want to follow me, he's telling his 5 friends, then develop this path. He'll explain that. Now he qualifies, and really what he's explaining is the first noble truth. And the entire context of his teaching is right here. I teach the truth of stress or suffering and the truth of the path leading to the cessation of stress, nothing more. And he said that one statement over and over again. So on one hand, it's hard to understand why people would read this. Most modern Buddhists actually, just to be truthful about it, don't even read any of these suttas. But if you do read it, why would you even look for something more? If you're actually following what someone's teaching is, you'd listen to what they're teaching, I would think. And this I'm kind of maybe overemphasizing this a little bit, but this had such a profound impact on me when I first came across these teachings. For the first time, I realized what an awakened human being was actually teaching, not these contradictory and confusing teachings that I was exposed to so many years. This is the noble truth of stress. So the Buddha is going to describe it. Birth is stressful. Aging is stressful. Death is stressful. Sorrow, regret, pain, distress, and despair are all stressful. Furthermore, association with the unbeloved, or what you don't want, or who you don't want to be with, is stressful. And separation from what is loved or desired or clinging to is stressful. Not getting what is craved for is stressful. In short, the 5 clinging aggregates are stressful. We're going to touch on this a little bit more. But the 5 clinging aggregates of form, feeling, perceptions, mental fabrications, and consciousness simply describe the ongoing personal experience of suffering. We identify with our suffering through these 5 clinging aggregates. And so there's nothing really terribly profound in that statement describing suffering, is it? Except if you notice, every one of those things that the Buddha describes as suffering or stressful or disappointing are things that most of us as human beings are conditioned against even thinking about or looking at, or we do it in a way that only promotes more suffering, meaning a very analytical way, or as is often taught in many modern practices, not just modern Buddhism, that we should embrace our suffering, embrace our pain, and label it and dive into it. The Buddha simply says to recognize it. You don't have to do anything else with it. It's there. And he teaches us why it's there. It's there because of our own ignorance. And this, monks, is the noble truth of the origination of stress. The craving that makes for further becoming rooted in ignorance. Anything that would promote ignorance is what the Buddha is saying here. Further becoming. And accompanied by passion and delight in becoming further ignorant. That's a good reaction. We're the ones that are doing this to ourselves. Because rooted in a misunderstanding of self and the environment that we are in, we crave for sensual pleasure. And we crave for anything, excuse me. We crave for anything, including a self-created, self-imposed way of thinking that only continues our ignorance. Why? Because we've now attached ourselves to these views rooted in wrong views, promoting craving and clinging. Craving that makes for that further becoming. What is that craving? It's the craving that we all have for wanting more of what gives us pleasure and wanting less of anything that might take away from that pleasure. And so I often say that the Buddha could almost as accurately stated the first noble truth as there is distraction as saying there is suffering, because it is the preoccupation with stress, with suffering, with disappointment, with unsatisfactory experiences, the preoccupation with that causes us to lose our minds, literally, lose our concentration from constantly chasing after what I need, rather than simply living in the world and understanding the nature of stress. Let me go back one. The craving that makes for further becoming and accompanied by passion delight, relishing now here and now there by craving for sensual pleasure, craving for becoming, craving for non-becoming. Now here and now there just simply means everywhere. Wherever we find a self-referential experience in the world, we're establishing that ignorance in that self-reference, no matter what it is, because we've attached ourselves to something. Rather than seeing the discreteness, this is another big fallacy that we're all one giant organism. That's a complete contradiction to what the Buddha taught. The Buddha taught that we are and everything is discrete. The only true connection besides one that physicists can agree on, meaning that there is a certain connection based on the sum and substance of what makes us up. In a very practical way, we see things as completely discrete, including ourselves, our right view, as discrete and separate from anything else. In other words, I'm not my views. Well, an awakened right view. Am I clear about that? So as soon as I decide that it's 5 gallons of paint in the trunk that's going to solve my oil problems, and I spend the rest of my life believing that and finding enough people to associate with that will agree with the same thing, I'm going to be going through one car after another, aren't I? And I'm not being, I'm using a somewhat silly metaphor, but because I believe that I'm doing the right thing, there's no reason to change anything, is there? And so when I create a system of beliefs that allow me to continue my beliefs, I can only become further ignorant. Is that clear? Did I explain that well?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Craving for becoming, craving for non-becoming. And I've talked about what the difference between those two, and I won't get into it here, but I will when we get to dependent origination. Relishing now here and now there by craving for sensual pleasure, craving for becoming, craving for this is my words, craving for non-becoming means compulsive seeking to establish a self rooted in ignorance in every thought, word, and idea that occurs. One of the reasons why we don't realize how distracted we are is because every one of our thoughts is a self-reflective thought. We're familiar with this way of thinking. It's all that we think we are. Again, it's a mind rooted in ignorance. How would it recognize its own ignorance? How would it recognize that it's distracted? It needs first a real concentration practice. And then it needs the framework of the Eightfold Path to incorporate, to see that. And this, monks, is a noble truth of the cessation of stress. The remainderless fading and cessation, the renunciation, the relinquishment, the release, and the letting go of that very craving. The very craving for what? Craving for becoming. And the solution is to let go of that craving. Since that craving is rooted in I-making, we have to get into the heart. What does this really mean? And this points to the 3 marks of existence. And this, monks, is a noble truth of the way of practice, leading to the cessation of stress, precisely the Noble Eightfold Path. And then he reiterates what that is. Then he says, vision arose, insight arose, discernment arose, knowledge arose, illumination arose within me with regards to things never heard before. dukkha occurs. It's the first noble stress, the first noble truth. Remember in the Nagara Sutta where the Buddha is describing getting caught up in his feedback loop of wrong views bouncing off of that consciousness rooted in ignorance, and how he was finally able to achieve, and he said it repeatedly in that sutta, a breakthrough of understanding. That's what he's referring to. The breakthrough of understanding is recognizing stress occurs. Notice in the way that he's saying it too. It's so important. Stress occurs. It's completely impersonal. He's not saying stress occurs because of this, that, and the other thing, or stress occurs because you haven't prayed enough or chanted enough or bowed enough or connected with enough disincarnate beings to alleviate your stress. Stress occurs. As a consequence of having a human life, stress occurs. And if it, as a consequence of having a human life, stress occurs and I understand it, I'm going to stop running away from it or chasing after things that I hope to gain to avoid stress, to avoid disappointment. That's the kind of the key to the whole Buddhist teaching, isn't it? To understand stress occurs and I don't have to do anything about it. In fact, when I stop doing something about it and feel compelled to do something about what I feel is lacking right now, then my mind is at peace. And I'm always at peace because there's nothing left to disturb my mind. I don't need things to be different than they are. Vision arose, insight arose, discernment arose, knowledge arose, illumination arose within me with regards to things never heard before. The noble truth of stress is to be understood. So the Buddha is describing his process of awakening to his 5 friends. First, he said he's telling his friends, as I develop my profound understanding, I realize that stress occurs. And then I realized that in order to resolve this issue in myself, I need to understand this. Makes sense, doesn't it? In fact, when he describes an awakened human being from the point of view of right view, he says that that person has a view that has a profound understanding of suffering. Vision arose, insight arose, discernment arose, knowledge arose, illumination arose within me with regards to things never heard before. The noble truth of stress has been understood. Do you see with the progression? First he describes the problem, then he describes the solution to the problem is understanding what's occurring, and then he says, he's telling his friends that I found a way to understand stress. The truth of stress has been understood. He's also teaching them what they must do, isn't it? What we must do. And again, all the contradictory adaptations, accommodations, and embellishments to the Buddha's Dhamma were to distract one from doing just this, understanding stress. And if we understand that this is the sole purpose of the Buddha's Dhamma, and understand the incredible, profound nature of actually understanding stress, we wouldn't want to do anything else. Because we would understand that that is the key issue. Lorna, you had your hand.
Actually, just explain the question. So, thank you.
Okay. The noble truth of stress has been understood. Vision arose, insight arose, discernment arose, knowledge arose, illumination arose within me with regards to things never heard before. So he said that series of descriptions of developing understanding over and over again. He's emphasizing here the importance of gaining true insight, and it's insight into 3 marks of existence. With regards to things I've never heard before, it's another important line. I only say this to avoid any confusion from what you might come up against. And so almost all of Mahayana Buddhism, which is most, 99.9% of modern Buddhism, states that the Buddha's eightfold, or actually they usually dismiss the eightfold path by words, but saying the Buddha's path is a perennial path that he simply rediscovered. And it goes back endless eons to the endless Buddhas into the past, and it extends into the endless future to the endless future Buddhas. That's something that is based on fable and mythology, and it's not something the Buddha taught, and he says it right here. This is something that has never been heard before. And he never taught his path as a universal, perennial, I don't even know the right word that would describe something like that, as something that has always been around and will always be around. He simply he called it timeless, meaning that it is applicable throughout time. It's just as useful now as it was then.
So isn't John just, why couldn't it have existed if it's a truth? Why wasn't it there to begin with?
I would say because there wasn't a human being who looked at it correctly and put the effort into figuring it out. I mean, it may have been, there may have been other people that had developed this. Maybe they called it something else.
Or it's just there.
Well, if you think about this, the 8 factors of the Eightfold Path, yeah, I'm not sure if I'm going to contradict myself. Individually, the right factors, the 8 factors of the Eightfold Path are present in the world. They just, right view is a view that,
like a truth is a truth.
Yeah, the reason why I almost stopped myself is that I don't know, again, it very well may be true, but I don't know that there was ever a meditation method that the Buddha taught before. Because even the meditation methods that were so prevalent during his time were designed to disunite the mind from the body and establish itself in non-physical realms. They all were like that.
He put it together.
He put it together. He figured it out. And it's this brilliant human being. And according to his words, these are things that have never been heard before. The solution to the problem.
Because you can say, I'm going to put that oil in the trunk and think that's the way and keep blowing up your car. But he's saying you have to do these 8 things.
Yeah. Yeah. And thanks for bringing it up, David. He says you have to do these things. This is what you do. But then it's not any more than that, is it? And there's nothing superhuman. It doesn't take any type of extraordinary effort to develop the Eightfold Path, does it? It's simple and direct. It's not something complex. It's not something that takes endless eons. And it's something that any human being can begin right here, right now.
But John, is he saying that it's not, as a human being, if you keep doing the same thing over and over again and it's not working, I mean, I personally, I try something else.
Oh, yeah.
But I guess there are enough people out there that keep doing the same thing over and over that they don't make the connection that that's not the right thing to do.
Yeah, and they'll shift because I can't keep a car running by dumping paint in the trunk every week. I think I'm just going to start riding a bike. So the solution isn't any solution at all, is it? I've simply shifted my ignorance to something else that's acceptable to me. And we do that, and again, not just in modern Buddhism, but that's what a lot of modern Buddhist practices. That's why the great majority of at least Western Buddhist practitioners will say something like this, is I learned this from this teacher, I learned that from that lineage, I heard this on the internet, so-and-so said this, and they cobble it all together and call it their Buddhist practice. In fact, this is encouraged today by most people. But that's really just what you're talking about, Mary. It's just a shifting and a constant shifting of my focus to something so I don't have to deal with my own ignorance. And again, we do it all the time. And so once we get past that notion that it needs to be more, and we settle into this Eightfold Path, we're going to start studying that next week, what it actually means, then I can begin the process of developing wisdom and knowledge and self-awakening. According to a Buddha, according to Siddhartha Gautama. Nobody has to believe this human being. In fact, he never said, take what I'm saying as a belief system, don't take it on blind faith. He said, in fact, if it's going to work for you, you have to do this. You have to develop it yourself. With regards to things never heard before, this is a noble truth of the origination of stress. This noble truth of the origination of stress is to be abandoned. This noble truth of the origination of stress has been abandoned. So he just described his process of coming up to this understanding of stress, developing the profound understanding, and actually accomplishing that fact. And the Buddha continues, Vision arose, insight arose, discernment arose, knowledge arose, illumination arose within me with regards to things never heard before. This is the noble truth of the cessation of stress. Meaning he understands what it is. This noble truth of the cessation of stress is to be directly experienced. Again, remember the setting. He's teaching his 5 friends. You must have the direct experience of this. It's not enough. And again, the setting is that they all were wandering around northern India seeking miracles, seeking that one teacher that could say the magic words and they would be transformed out of this world into another world, basically, just generalizing it. He's saying all of that stuff that we did together as buddies all those years was a waste of time because nobody can impose this on you, but you can have the direct experience of it. That was one of the most empowering things I think I've ever come across in my life, because it was really the first time, maybe besides giving up drugs and alcohol, that was pretty significant. But the outside of that, it was the first time that I realized that I was in control of my life experience. I knew I wasn't in control of everything that would happen, but I was in control of the way that I experienced my life. And I can still remember what that felt like. In fact, I remember where I was when I read this and I kind of got it. It's up to me. I was still kind of crazy and distracted. But because I started integrating in this way, the 4 Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, I was slowly able to start reuniting my mind and my body. And it made sense. And the more it made sense and the more I had the direct experience of it, the more sure I was of what I was doing. That, you all know how I emphasize how important it is to recognize the benefits too, not just go through this as a rote practice. The Buddha continues, the noble truth of the cessation of stress has been. But first he says you have to have the direct experience, and then the awakening is the noble truth of the cessation of stress has been directly experienced. So he's offering this great encouragement that if you do this, you will have this direct experience. Vision arose, insight arose, discernment arose, knowledge arose, illumination arose within me with regards to things never heard before. This is the noble truth of the way of practice leading to the cessation of stress. This noble truth of the way of practice leading to the cessation of stress is to be developed. He's telling them and us now what we're supposed to do with this Eightfold Path. We're supposed to develop it. The noble truth of the way of practice leading to the cessation of stress has been developed. And what do we get when we develop it? We are awakened. It has been developed. He's describing to his friends what he did and now what they must do. Nothing different. The Buddha never taught something that he didn't himself have that direct experience with. Monks, as long as my knowledge and vision concerning these 4 noble truths was not pure, I did not claim to have directly self-awakened. The significance in that is almost every spiritual, almost every religion, not everyone, there's many that have, but most modern religions have a prophet somewhere in there. In other words, someone who came to a physical form with all knowledge and then spread that knowledge. The Buddha said, I did this on my own. Nothing was given to me. I'm not a prophet. And it's so important to understand that. He's simply a human being who figured things out in a most profound way and taught us how to do the same thing. My self-awakening is unexcelled in the cosmos, even, and he's now speaking to the mythology of his time and even today about disincarnate beings somehow having some significant impact on us. Even with its deities, Maras and Brahmas, with its contemplatives and Brahmins, its royalty and common folk. He's saying that none of that has an influence on it. But as soon as my knowledge and vision concerning these 4 noble truths was truly pure, then I did claim to have rightly self-awakened. An awakening unexcelled in the cosmos. Knowledge and vision arose in me. Unprovoked is my release, meaning there's not a shred of ignorance left in him, in the Buddha's mind, in Siddhartha's mind, to provoke further becoming ignorant. Unprovoked is my release. This is the last birth. There is no further becoming. Unprovoked is his release. He's abandoned all remnants of ignorance. There's nothing left to cling to. And there's no clinging left. And that last line, this is the last birth, is, well, again, we'll get more into this in a week or two on karma and rebirth. The Buddhist is talking about a future physical rebirth, but in the context, what he's really saying is, because I've abandoned all ignorance, there's nothing left within me that could give birth to another moment rooted in ignorance. This is the last birth of that. I thought that was the end. This is what the Buddha said, and the group of 5 monks were delighted at his words. While this discourse was being given, Venerable Khandana declared, all conditioned things that arise are subject to cessation. All conditioned thinking, all thinking rooted in ignorance. All conditioned things, meaning conditioned things and conditioned thinking means thinking conditioned or influenced by ignorance. And so if your thinking is influenced and conditioned by ignorance, your experience with the outer world is going to be the same thing. It's going to be perceived from that. Khandana declared all conditioned things that arise are subject to cessation. Having heard Khandana, the Buddha exclaimed, so you really know, Khandana, you really know. You are now Anakhandana, the one who understands. That's the end of that sutta. So just upon hearing those words, I remember Khandana was also doing the same studies, or basically the same studies as the Buddha was. So he had a pretty good understanding of what it wasn't. And now he finally heard for the first time what it was. And he was able to make that clear distinction in his mind that it was conditioned thinking and looking at the world in a conditioned way that was the problem. And that all of that conditioned thinking in his mind arises and it also passes away. He's expressing a profound understanding of the 3 marks of existence in that. So that's today's talk. Let me invite Sarah. You're unmuted. How are you today?
Doing well, thank you.
Great. What do you think about this sutta, and any other questions or comments you might have?
I'm just taking it all in.
Oh, good. I'm glad you joined us today.
Thank you.
Jen, good to see you.
It's good to see you. I have a very distracted mind today, so I'm kind of reluctant to say anything other than all conditioned things that arise are subject to cessation.
Yeah, that's a pretty good thing to hold in mind. Thank you. Lorna, good to see you. Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. Just like Jen, I noticed when we talk really to the heart of the matter, you just can't take it in. You're just very distracted, as Jen said. You just reject it.
Resist. Yeah.
And I've just had the experience that Jen's had. You know, it's hard to concentrate on your words and on your meaning when your mind is trying to not go there. And this was one of those teachings that was just difficult to concentrate on. Even though we obviously come willing and want to learn this, it's difficult to learn. It was one of those mornings. But that doesn't mean to say that it's been a waste of time by any means. We have to just go through this process and keep turning up for class, learning the bits and things, you know, even if it's just 1 or 2 sort of aspects of the Dharma that you haven't really appreciated before. This is what we come for. Jen's just made one comment. I would just add to another comment that I don't think I've realized before today that I've even forgotten how you phrase it now. That there is so much sadness and dukkha, what do they call it? Well, stress.
Yeah.
And that there is stress in the world. And the relationship between our thinking and stress, that we make our own stress.
Yeah.
But there fundamentally is stress in the world. I don't think I've really made that connection quite like I have this morning.
And it was a remarkable class for getting
Yeah.
that. And really, that's such a profound insight.
And then just to add on to that, I mentioned this last week as well, about my meditation here in the morning. When I come on a Saturday, Tuesday, my meditations in the group here are actually on a roll. I mean, I seem to be more fulfilled, and we don't talk about our soul, so I can't mention it that way, but it's like it's my soul is like filled, and I seem to be getting a lot out of these group meditations.
Yeah.
So thank you everybody for coming. I appreciate all of you. And I seem to be getting just a lot out of the group meditations at the moment, rather than being at home and do it singularly, which is a task and a duty and all those things that we must apply ourselves to do twice a day. But here it's really quite on a roll. So I appreciate, as I say, everybody coming today, and thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I do. And I meditate twice a day, every day in my spot, usually with Bodhi. But I so look forward to meditating with all of you here. And this new place is just, we just kind of fell right into this. It's comfortable immediately. So.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
David, good morning.
Morning, John. Next week I'm going to a 5-day, basically, managers meeting. And our boss has us read these books, 5 Dysfunctions and Crucial Conversations. And as I read this, you can see the flaw in the whole approach. It's not a understanding where suffering comes from. Here's the solution.
Yeah.
Heart, emotion. And I struggle with going into this meeting without like doing my hacky version of trying to show them what they need to do, follow the equal path. You can't work that into a management meeting with 6 people. It's just so listening to you say the Eightfold Path, it's Four Noble Truths. It's these understanding and insight to the mark of existence. So I thank you for your teachings. It's the full package you have to commit to, and not this some version of mindfulness and having good intentions, but without it all, will just be something that will disappear.
Yeah.
2 days later. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So some of the strategies that in general that we employ to try to resolve the suffering in the world or the dysfunction in a business are really laughable when you look at them, because they can't really work. But that being said, sometimes they have the effect on the particular situation, and that's helpful, I suppose. But, and I guess since the beginning of humankind, we've developed ever more intricate strategies to deal with our own stress and suffering and need for distraction, don't we? And so
it's almost like show restraint, being mindful. They use all the words, but with no framework.
Yeah, it's just a concept of just really what all of that is trying to teach us to be something that we can't unless we let go of ignorance first. But it doesn't address that problem. And again, that's what the Buddha realized. There wasn't any, no big profound, except that it's the truth, nothing hidden or mystical about the nature of suffering. He just described it. And the problem of, maybe next week, if I do try to sync the two classes back up again, I'll do the Salata Sutta, because that speaks directly to our part in this, isn't it? So maybe Saturday we'll do that, take a break from the course. Anyway, let me go, keep going. Lisa, good to see you.
It's good to be here, you and everyone. I have found this environment to be profoundly helpful to me in my daily life and this other life that's up here. Sort of crazy. I don't know which is crazier, the things that go on in my head and the things that I see going on out there.
Yeah. I don't think you can truly evaluate that properly. I think it's all just crazy.
I just see this helps me with something that I see as a very fundamental disconnect in human civilization and culture, where we have the just the most terrible brutality out there all over the world, and then we have right next to it is this amazing technology and scientific breakthroughs, and and then devices that do more and more complicated things. But I think a lot of the stuff that's invented is trying to be imposed on us, and I feel like it could be buried under it. Unless we have spaces like this and teachings and reading the book and just helping to counteract that.
I thank you. I agree completely. I don't know. Again, the Buddha never saw himself as savior. I certainly don't see this that way, and he never taught a salvific religion. It was because in his way of looking at it, that's a completely impractical thing to hope for, or to try for. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't hope for universal peace. But because of the nature of suffering, rooted in greed, aversion, and deluded thinking, as a consequence of living in this world, it's not likely to happen. So the best we can do is understand it. That's the conclusion that the Buddha came to. And so if we can understand it in ourselves, then we can understand it, the why of it in the world. Why is the world in such a state that it is today? Because of what the Buddha described, greed, aversion, and deluded thinking. What's the solution is developing understanding, but it's highly unlikely that more people than just a handful are going to develop the Eightfold Path, but at least we can. There's times when I look out, I don't get too distracted by the suffering in the world, but every now and then you can't help but hear something that really gets your attention. It usually has to do with children suffering, but not always. And I know that there's nothing I can do about any of that, except I can take refuge in the Dhamma, and it provides some peace and solace from what's going on in the world. And that's not selfish. That's true mental health. And then doing what we can, excuse the speech, and then doing what we can as individuals to teach others to carry this, and in any way we can. It doesn't mean that we're going to convince many people to take up the Eightfold Path either, but we can be examples of it and stop contributing. Next week going to be a good talk on the Salata Sutta. Stop contributing to the suffering in the world, by our own second arrow contribution, and remain at peace. What else can we do?
What's amazing is there's things going on in the world. There's million things going on in the world that we don't know anything about, and we just. But with technology, we know a lot more. We know, like, every bus, load of kids in whatever country that falls off, and I mean, there's a whole world we don't know anything about. But to put it a different way, this is a world I didn't know anything about before we started coming here, and it's just a great discovery.
Yeah, I agree. The
But a lot of people don't get it. Like, you sit there and meditate together. You're just sitting there. I mean, I can see what they're thinking. They're sitting there
doing nothing.
What's the what's the difference? Home, there, whatever. But when you don't know anything about something, you just can't describe. You just can't describe.
Yeah. When you're unfamiliar with something, you'll keep pouring the paint into the trunk rather than changing the oil. You just do it. We have the ability, I think, on this planet through technology, that no one person would have to do anything that they don't want to do. And what I mean is take a job of drudgery, because there's technology in place that we could feed everyone, and we could be engaged in activity that we like to. Maybe people like gardening or growing apples or whatever it might be, or putting paint in the trunk of a car. It doesn't matter. But we're never going to get there because the world is rooted in greed, aversion, and deluded thinking. It needs pockets of control all over the world. Some of it's less aberrant than others. But it's all because collectively, as a society, our thinking is rooted in ignorance. We just don't know what to apply. We've been trying to legislate peace and fairness since the beginning of time, I think. And I don't know that we're much closer to it, but that's just an expression of the first noble truth, dukkha occurrence. But you're right. We have this. We've come around. Again, this is when I realized that it was the most remarkable thing is we've come across a practice to leave that behind, in a sense, in a very practical way, that we can live in the world without being constantly distracted by it and understand the nature of suffering of other people. And because Lorna mentioned something earlier this morning, that because of her understanding of the nature of suffering within herself, she can understand it in a significant person in her life. And so there's no reaction there anymore, is there? Because we understand it. And that's how it works with us as we develop the Dhamma. We understand the suffering of the world. We don't react to it. We don't lose our minds over it. And because of that, we're better able to make a practical difference in the world. But who knows where it's going to go? Thank you, Lisa. Mary, good to see you this morning.
Good to be here. Good to see everyone. This is a good sutta. Very elementary. I think probably like everyone, you try and incorporate and integrate this into your life moment by moment. Certain areas you resist it. I still think back to a few months ago when you said where there is conflict, there is ignorance. You can identify anytime you're in conflict, which is less and less now. But when you do find your mind in conflict, you can recognize that you're off the path. And you don't have to overanalyze it. Come back to your breath. Take a moment to look at it. So very, very practical. I'm on the path. And sometimes I'm off. But trying to recognize it, moment by moment, to do a little bit better each time. And just, greater awareness. So this is all very good, very helpful. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And you're a little bit at a time, you've developed a rather profound and effective understanding, haven't you? Mm-hmm. It really is just a couple. I remember that, I think the first retreat that you were at, where you were coming to class before that, but that kind of jump-started everything for you, didn't it? Really remarkable.
Yeah, it was a remarkable, auspicious day.
It was. Thank you. Liz, good to see you.
Good to see you. It's good to be here. I don't really have anything to add. I think a little bit of what everyone has said here today is what I've been thinking. So thank you.
Thank you. Jay, good to see you this morning. How are you?
I'm good. A lot of things going through my mind to react. This fellow who's going, I don't know your name, I'm sorry.
David.
David, you're going to that meeting where they're going to give you instant karma and make you a fine manager and make more money for you. Why don't you just keep it on them? You know, tell them, hey, I go to a Buddhist course and, you know, this is helpful, and, you know, give them the Four Noble Truths and a handout and, you know, the Eightfold Path and ride on it. They're not going to fire you for that, are they? I hope not. But that's what I would. If
I do things in a subtle way, and
A little more subtle than that. Get out, get out.
I try not to, because you can, when you challenge someone, you're challenging that bubble that they've created.
Yeah.
And they're saying, here's the answer.
Yeah.
So you have to tread lightly sometimes, because some people aren't ready. Some, you know, groups aren't ready.
No, it's tricky. To many people, it's going to sound like you're telling them you're doing something wrong. Do this. This is right.
I'd love to be a fly on the
Yeah.
wall.
You don't have to put it in
Really-
terms. You don't have to make it a conflict. You know, be as weird as you want is my policy. if you don't piss off at least half the people you meet day to day, you're doing something wrong.
Yeah.
I mean,
I-
that's my way of doing things. I jump right into stuff, you know. I don't mind really care who I might aggravate, you know. But to get to what you said, John, about the poor kids, and you worry about them, and you know that they're suffering. When you go by somebody who's standing out in the middle of the street with the tin can, or they got the ribbon with the Susan Coleman thing and whatever, you're helping, you know. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. And
Not at all. No.
no, I mean, that's once you realize all these great things about how to conduct your life and be comfy, you're still in the world, and you can still do very practical things to help things out.
Yeah.
And that's also been one of my things that I go by. I try and really do positive things if I can. You know, some people don't want you messing around with what they're involved in, but you know, again, I have a tough skin, and I never let that bother me a lot.
Mhm.
And just to wind up, I would have to say that at the moment, in the words of the famous Louis Jordan, an all-time blues and jazz guy, Jack, I'm mellow. At the moment.
Thank you, Jay. Mary, good to see you.
Good to be here. I always, all my life, well, my adult life anyway, always said, shit happens.
Yeah.
But I never quite knew what to do with it from that point. I mean, I realized that a lot of times, you know, people beat themselves up over something happened. It's like, well, it happened. Don't try to take different steps next time, but don't beat yourself up, and certainly
Yeah.
don't blame everyone else. It's
Right.
simply something that happened. And it's very easy to say, but
Yep.
this gives you the other layer. This gives you a way to actually deal with that and not have it feed back and cause more stress.
I agree. I think that, and I've often thought about this, the translation from the word from dukkha happens to stress happens. I think it's much better if the Buddha just said shit happens, because it gets right to it. Because and so it does. You know, it just does. There's nothing personal about it. Nothing. Sarah, don't go anywhere, because we're going to finish with something you're familiar with.
Can I just say something? I just wanted to kind of throw this out, because David, what you were saying sort of kind of put it into words for me with this thing that I've been struggling with lately, where I tried to verbalize it the last time I was here, where it's almost like I'm trying to say that the Eightfold Path is the only solution in the entire world for everyone all the time, which I know is more conditioned thinking. So like, for example, with David's example, I'm not saying you're doing this, but something that I might do in that situation is, no, none of these things that you've come up with is the problem. The real problem is that you all need to awaken. And if you awaken, then you'd be the perfect man. But in reality, like, what's the goal here? Well, the goal is just to be a better manager. It's not to end all suffering. So I don't need to make that connection right now and say everybody just needs to awaken and then my problems would be solved. And no one has a problem with my thinking about it, but I just can't let go of like craving for, it's just more craving, but I can't.
Well,
Yeah.
that's the nature of a mind rooted in ignorance, though, to blame others for, again, if the world would just wake up, then I'm good to go. Imagine if the Buddha thought that, 26 or Siddhartha thought that. I got it all figured out. It's up to them now. It wasn't up to them. It's up to us.
Or if he got frustrated that why aren't you all awakening? I just said the most profound thing imaginable.
Yeah.
What's your problem?
Well, and just because I said so,
right.
You should. I mean,
right. I'm here as a living example.
Yep. And isn't that what a lot of so-called spiritual teachers say?
Right.
Do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean,
or a lot of management meetings. So
well, yeah. I mean, it's unfortunately it's as rampant in modern Buddhism as it is, and I'm not putting any of it down, in Roman Catholicism, the brutality on children. But it again, those people, excuse the vernacular, they're elders, they're teachers. They believe that they're right, but that arrogance lets them get to that point, rather than taking to this, looking at your own ignorance and emptying yourself.
But I think at the end of the day, it's up to each of us to work on this, right? It's not outward.
Yes.
It is. It absolutely is about what's going on in my head. That's about it. It's what's going on in my head, and what I can do to not cause pain and suffering in others and myself. And that sometimes we have to remember that it's not external. Just like certain things aren't personal that happen, and you want to blame or those things, that all of a sudden your life becomes outward. And we have to remind ourselves that it's internal. It's just, that's it. And if we go too far beyond that, I think we're stepping outside the bounds of, how we might need to be handling this. At least I keep myself in check that way.
Yeah, and it has nothing to do with the conditions in the world, because as a Buddha said, dukkha occurs. My position here in developing the Dhamma is to understand it.
Yeah.
It sounds like that an awakened altruistic mind would be more concerned with the suffering out in the world than the suffering in the world. But that's a mind that doesn't understand the nature of suffering. Suffering is going to occur no matter what I do. But what I can do is to develop my own understanding and not contribute to it. And if enough people did that, there really would be peace in the world. But again, the only person I can affect, I can only walk the path for myself and be an example towards others. And that's what we all do. And even in a case like David's, and a situation that's not likely would welcome him standing up and pounding on the desk that all of you should be meditating, but people notice a much calmer David, and a few people they already have asked, boy, you're different.
Practice,
and then you
can understand that it's just passes.
Right.
So I don't need to convince my boss that he needs to integrate something else. It's something that arises and passes, and that's the wisdom that you're gaining through the concentration you're developing.
Yeah, it's all directly experienced. It's not one single thing that's taken on faith or is bestowed on us from outside agencies or non-physical realms. Just whether they're true or not doesn't matter. If we want to awaken, we do this, and that's the point of today's talk. So I think I'm going to introduce another sutta next Saturday. Again, mostly just try to sync the classes back up together. But so for the next week or two, maybe read this a few times, read the chapter on the Four Noble Truths, and then really look at how your understanding of these four truths has developed since you started Dhamma practice. And I think you'll realize you've come a long way towards gaining a profound understanding of this most important teaching. So because Sarah's here, I want to do one thing. We're going to finish with, Sarah's joined us from Maine. She follows us. She's one of our Sangha members. And she sent me her rendition of Metta a couple months ago. I think we've played it once or twice here on Saturday, or maybe Tuesday, but I want to play it again, Sarah. And just, what's
Don,
that?
I did have one thing I wanted to share.
Please.
That as we talk about the relieving of distractions, one of the beautiful things about the Four Noble Truths is that it does free us and lead us into the Eightfold Path that leads us into the meditation that positions us so that we begin to respond to life intuitively instead of reacting to life. And that's when we become world changers, not because we're trying to change the world, but just because it works. And that's what I find in my life, just working with my students and in the relationships around me, that the more that I am centered and in that position of meditating and not allowing myself to be distracted and rejecting the distractions, the more I respond effectively because I'm responding intuitively.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. You recognize rather quickly direct benefits of taking to this practice. So, and that's just how it should be. Sarah and I are going to have a conversation later today or maybe tomorrow. Sarah wants to start a well-focused sangha up in Maine. So we're going to do that. So, you may be joining us again on Saturday. So, and the other was the retreats coming up, May 16th and 19th. Sign up as soon as you can. I hope you all join me. Those that have come on retreat know how the value of, you just can't, the depth of understanding that's develops on a retreat is just not available any other way. So we're going to finish with Metta, with Sarah's rendition of Metta, if it plays right. So here we go. Might take a minute to load. Loads it all. Sorry, folks, I can't get it to load. Let me try one more thing. I don't mean to keep you going, but
Maybe Sarah can.
On your computer hooked up?
I'm gonna think I can get it this way. But I don't know why that's so slow. iPad, whatever that's called. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah.
I'll talk to you later. Thank you all for a wonderful class.
Great
Peace.
job.
Thank you, Sarah.
See you, Sarah.
Bye.